I'm sorry to drag you through this chore. It's worse than tedious because, of course, you've no desire to vote for anyone. You know it's either going to be Reds or Blues. It's going to be Reds. Whilst the other parties get to tell Doctor Who-worthy fairy tales in their manifestos and then stick their toddler-cum-crayon attack cereal box brainstorms up on the staff canteen fridge like they're serious. I have to be serious, is what I imagine Rishi Sunak's personal draft read before he handed it over to his media team. Say what you like about Boris, but he called an election when the country was feeling pretty shit and won it. That's incredibly unusual. Keir Starmer had barely enough puff to ruffle the man's albino hair. He should have walked it. Instead, it took Truss and Sunak. Oh, this is going to be used by pub bores as an argument against diversity, isn't it? To beat the country so low that Starmer's triumphant waiting paid off. Let's start with a few obvious points. 1. Brexit, COVID and the war in Ukraine would have created the same national mood of despair under any party or leader. This is because of the squeeze on the economy and therefore the stretchiness of your pounds. 2. British values is a policy that holds no currency. It doesn't improve your life, your job, your taxes, or your youth. It's the same as Make America Great Again. It doesn't have any meaning except to make you think of when you were young and you didn't worry about these things, because you were chancing around for someone to have sex with instead. But the country at this moment in time is undoubtedly better off than it was back then. 3. I'm willing to bet that you cannot name a single policy that a government promised and enacted that made a difference to your life. Not even Brexit. I mean, could you grasp something tangible? Point to a number on a piece of paper? 4. Every party adheres to the same economic rules. To keep as many people in work as possible so they can collect taxes. 5. The Conservatives will not win this election, simply because of the national mood. Our votes for Labour will be a signal we want change, even though we know very little will. As democracy goes, Labour winning by simply not being the Conservatives is pretty rubbish. Labour could have copy-pasted the Conservative manifesto and they'd still get in. 6. The main thing that's going to get Labour in, however, is the Reform Party, who are taking the other right-wingers who previously voted Conservatives. Again, not a great showing for democracy if, for Labour to win, they just need all the right-wing parties to be doing equally well. Even if they outnumber the left, they mean nothing if not united. If the Lib Dems suddenly surge in the polls, expect sweat from Mr. Starmer. 7. You can't trust politicians. There's no mechanism or policy to hold them to their word, so they might as well just make shit up. I'm afraid nobody ever thinks about how their brilliant idea could be exploited. We all glaze over with misty-eyed happiness at how the world would be with the change we want to make. And then we go back to paying the bills. For the fanciful few who actually get their ideas a fair hearing and a modest budget, it's barely any different. They'll be warned about how the system can be gained, but they won't see it happening in their utopia, because they've forgotten about people. It's easy to lie. It's easy to dodge questions. I do both just texting. I lie about finding things funny, and I can dodge repeated invites to social situations for months until I get to say, sorry, it's too late to make a spare of the moment arrangement. Politicians clearly realise that whoever set up their game of power assumed they'd be honourable servants of the state, not social climbers looking for bragging rights and a career where doing nothing is the optimal strategy. Doing so little, in fact, that you don't even need to worry much about elections if the country dislikes your opposition enough. The Conservatives have managed to stay in power for 13 years, with 3 out of the 5 unelected prime ministers, and the other 2 never getting more than 44% of the votes. But sure, you can call them local/national representatives if you like. Surely, playing honourably will be reflected in the public response. Well, the opposition will say you're more than fucking welcome to try. The same can be said of football. For years, the sport had to drag its heels, wringing its hands about admitting its rules allowed the capacity for lying. But even after the simulation rule, that doesn't stop players pretending they're in more pain than they are, because that's subjective. And if you look like you've taken a bitch slap from Thur, it can influence the human referee immensely. Politicians know that running a country is horrendously dense, difficult to understand, and boring. But essentially it boils down to increase income, lower spends, buy supplies, and improve quality of life, which applies to everyone equally. Which isn't jazzy or exciting either. So, like a bored married couple, Labour and the Conservatives are reduced to arguing about the twatty things like mowing lawns and tidying cupboards, the new couch, the number of shoes, or which friends to invite. Not a word of it means anything. It's never mattered to you. The fact is, the capitalistic, economically driven private sector is the only part of your life that positively or negatively affects you. Sure, the government affect bins, taxes, NHS, schools, and benefits, but unless your life is solely dependent on those things, in other words, if you don't have a job, they're outliers, an equal part in the orbit of everyone's life, but not the planet they live on. Show me a government that wants to negatively curtail private sector profits, and I'll point you to sweatshops. I'm voting based on my own experience, how negatively my life's gone, and to be honest, I can't blame the government for any of it. As I've said, I think any of the parties would have come out in the last few years divided, inconsistent, and clutching at power. Similarly, the credit crunch that brought down Labour years ago would have, I'm sure, been handled no differently by the Conservatives, BNP, Greens, or Lib Dems. I'm torn. I've voted Conservatives in the past because my working life has gone very well under them. I don't for a second believe it was because of them, but as I say, you can only base these things on your experiences. However, I have noticed a considerable toughness of late, so I'm definitely not voting for them this time. It's the only time the government's negativity has affected my positivity, so I'm out. It may also turn out to be a long time before I forgive the Tories for allowing the vote on Brexit. I'm also not voting for reform because I can't think of a single reason to pin this toughness on immigrants. They don't cause me any trouble, so I don't see the problem. I can't blame immigrants any more than I can blame the Conservatives for everything that's happened. In my heart, I'm a liberal, or a green. I'm a capitalistic socialist with a thirst not for conservation, but for actual futuristic, oh my god, it's a Klingon captain progress, which is, in my opinion, the only way to restore the glory of this country's last great world-leading moment, the Industrial Revolution. Child labour, appalling health conditions, capitalistic low pay, environmental damage, and general exploitation notwithstanding. Yet I still cannot, even with all the faith I can muster, vote for Lib Dems or Greens. The threat of the Reform Party looms large over me. I know that the older population vastly outnumbers the younger, and the percentage of them who will vote too. Geriatrics triggered Brexit. They're drawn to the idea of restoring this country to something they can't quite put their finger on. However, the sight of immigrants is something they can put a whole hand on, and they see foreign names, they hear foreign accents, and they can even point to areas on the map where they live and give it a label: non-British values. I can understand this. When Starmer and Sunak talk about their policies, they mean fuck all to me. As I've said, we won't get anything different. Immigration is something I can see in the street too, without effort, without talking to any of them. They're not white, and they can't hide it. Or when they come to fix a boiler and they open their mouth, they can't disguise it. Or when their name pops up in a chat, it's illegible to us. We can see it everywhere, so when Farage talks about it, we do understand it. This frightens me, because I'm reasonable enough to assume that the rising cost of materials, imports, and the effects of inflation that have made the country so miserable cannot be attributed to immigrants, any more than the white and the squeezed middle of society. Go ahead, try and form a logical flowchart that pins the bankrupt economy on any non-millionaire in this country, let alone a single or group of immigrants. Similarly, I can't think of any problems that might be labelled as the fault of immigration. Stretching the NHS is made far worse by old people and their propensity to hardly ever want to die these days, and without the roll-up-your-sleeves, round-the-clock care of immigrants, a lot more would. Crime is not something I can exclude my own white race from either, nor are the benefits sheets. Housing issues are caused by landlords with more houses than they have cousins, and again, the geriatrics' determination to keep on living. So in my fear of allowing reform any kind of foothold in my life, and so I can feel I've in some way protected those who need my help, I'll not be stealing votes from Labour by voting where my allegiance truly lies. Instead, I'll be voting Labour to make sure they get into government. Doesn't that say everything about our political system? I haven't mentioned a single Labour policy. In fact, I've been pretty condescending about them. The only reason I'm voting for them is because they're a safe bet to beat the opposition. I know that even if over 60% of the UK does vote right-wing, either Tories or Reform, then Labour can still win because it's about 326 seats, not votes. By the way, I know there's 650 seats, but only 326 matter, so the others can all fuck off. I'm not anti-Labour, even though they've never done anything for me. But I do have one reason to separate myself from them. I'm a royalist. Contrary to many popular Labour beliefs, the royals are not a drain on society. The evidence that they are in fact a major boost to the economy is well established. The profits from their lands all go to the government, comfortably outweighing their frankly embarrassing for royalty salaries, and the tourism revenue they create could rival the FTSE 100. However, I do think the time has come to change their role up a bit. Their role in politics has, since Magna Carta, been diminished by Parliament, for good reasons. Now they're reduced to a few honorary stagings in their role with politics. I believe the time has come for their stagings to be reformed, intended ironically. I think it's nice that the Prime Minister, whoever he or she, but it's overwhelmingly more likely to be he, has to pretend to seek authority from this archaic establishment. It keeps them grounded in the same way that you and I are, because we answer to our CEO, who isn't. I'm not suggesting the king starts his own party or picks a side. Since Brexit and Trump, we've begun tentatively fact-checking politicians more often. But they still rarely have to answer to us. Prime Ministers would have to answer to the king, though. I'm giddy at the thought of it. Imagine the fantastic theatre of it if the king released a weekly Christmas Day-style statement fact-checking how the Prime Minister was failing to meet their election campaign policies, and then, an hour later, news cameras follow the Prime Minister's Jaguar as it gingerly pulls up to Buckingham Palace with a glum, guilty and quivering Etonian getting out of the car, ready to get their knuckles rapped by a metre-long wooden ruler. Ruler can be taken in either definition here, for whichever causes you the greatest Schadenfreudian pleasure. We have this old system in place. The Prime Minister pretends to keep the monarch in check, and the monarch is in turn supposed to help the Prime Minister get over themselves. Except we're excluded from the most entertaining bit. So, Charles III, if you're reading this, I'm imploring you to get your advisors to find you some legal loophole to cite as your reasoning to get more involved in your country. Do something neither your subjects or the media can do, and hold the Prime Minister accountable, so the rest of us can stop blaming immigrants and blame their disinterest for respectability instead. Honestly, you don't have to do anything more arduous than give the floppy-haired influencer a kick up the backside and send him home with a letter to read to the class.